A big thank you to PlayStation for sponsoring this content.
Hi! A few months ago, these guys asked me to make this guy, so I'm going to show you how I did that. Hi, and welcome back to Building Boy, the series where I take you through how I built my Atreus cosplay from Sony Santa Monica's God of War Ragnarök. It's the week of the tunic. This tunic, I very happily stated, was one of the hardest things I've ever made, and that still remains true. It was such a challenge to work out because there's so many little bits to it, but I am so incredibly proud of the result, and I'm excited to share with you guys how I got to that end result, because as much as it was a difficult process, I love the end result so much. I think it's really effective, and I had a lot of fun working it out, so let's start that. Now, I stated in my last video that I'm not really going to share my patterning process because I kind of wing it quite a lot and it's not really going to be helpful to anyone, but the good news for you is that for this video, I will be sharing a little bit of my patterning process. So how do we begin? Well, you drag in a very willing partner, friend, family member, and you arm them with cling film, tape, and scissors, which kind of sounds like a horror film, which I'd be down to watch. So yeah, if you're a cosplayer, you're probably already familiar with this process. You literally make your own pattern by wrapping yourself up in cling film, covering it in tape to like solidify the shape, and then you draw on whatever pattern you'd like. Now, I only really wanted to pattern the actual body piece of this. The sleeve, I knew I could just kind of, again, wing it and just go by my measurement. So I just wanted to get sort of an exact measurement of my chest. Using a Sharpie, we marked out where the seam lines on the top would be. We then went in and cut those lines and used them as like cutting guides basically to make the pattern. I then very precariously removed it, and once that was off, we then went in to pattern the piece. Using the pre-made pattern, I took it onto my leather and used some chalk just to mark out where the pattern would be. Obviously make sure you're doing it the right way around so that you've got the outside of the material facing the floor. Once the two main panels of the top were cut out, I could then go in and start roughly sewing it together. Luckily, this leather was really soft and thin, so I could pin and sew through it really easily using my like normal sewing machine foot. Once it was very roughly sewn, I then went in and just trimmed up any excess seams. And then the scary part came in, because this is where I had to start cutting apart this leather. I had a very exact amount of how much I needed for Boy, so I was really nervous about starting to cut it apart and take it apart. But obviously I had to add the areas where the fur panels sit. So I went in with I marked out where those panels were and then went in with my scissors and just started chopping it apart. I really closely followed the references in this part because I did not want to screw this up. Like I said, I had a very limited amount of this leather and I didn't want to risk running out. I bought this absolutely gorgeous faux wolf fur that I would then use for those fur segments. It has this beautiful layering and just looked like a wolf pelt, which is what I was going for. When working with fur, I like to mark out which way the fur naturally sits, just so that when I cut it out, I know it's not going to be like sitting upside down, because obviously all the fur sits downwards, and I didn't want it to be like, you know, flowing upwards, so I just make sure to mark that out so I know what I'm working with. And then using the cut out segments from the leather tunic, I then transfer those onto the fur. I mark out exactly where they're going to sit. And this is where marking out the direction of the fur is really helpful, just so you know, again, that the piece is sitting the right way up. When cutting faux fur, I like to use a craft knife and not scissors. When you use scissors, you cut jagged chunks out of the fur, whereas when you use a knife, you're just cutting the bottom part of this fabric down. You're not actually cutting the fur, it's just like the material the fur adheres to. So that's my little tip if you're working with faux fur. Once those pieces are all cut out, I could then go in and start pinning them to the leather. Now technically I could have sewn this through my machine again, but I really wanted to make sure that the seams were really tight and strong because I knew this would be sort of stretching over my body. So I decided to go in and actually hand stitch all of this. Because then if like the material stretched at all, you'd actually be able to see little bits of hand stitching, so it's another nice little detail. Getting through the faux leather and the fur by hand took a while, but again, I just think that the effect is really good. So as well as the shoulder bits of fur, Atreus also has these little like segments of fur like peeking out of the shirt, so I also cut out those chunks and just sewed the fur there as well. It's not very technical, I just literally sewed the fur into where it is on the reference on the costume. I think the effects are really nice, and I'm really happy of the colour matching compared to the reference. And then I kind of got carried away with the crafting process, so I'm going to let Abby from a few months ago catch you up on that.
So I haven't shared all the progress because I kind of just got stuck into it. I sort of mentioned about how I had an idea of how to attach it. So the way that this goes on is, this is the neckline here, and it pops on under the shoulders, like over the shoulders. So basically that's the shoulder, so it pops together. Under here, we then have another popper, which just goes in. So we've got the armhole there, and then I'm going to change slightly. I'm going to take this little panel away, but we've got eyelets that are going to tie up at the side, just like the front of my actual tunic. So it's all really similar then. But yeah, we're getting there. I just got a bit carried away. At the moment, I'm just taking my thinning scissors and I'm just thinning out the edges of the fur on the tunic so I can add some stitching. And yeah.
Now we're moving on to the more heavy detail work. I wanted to just thin up the fur. I just used some like hair thinning scissors to take some bulk out of the fur edges, especially where I wanted to add some hand stitching details. And now it's time for the sleeve. Again, I measure this completely by eye. I measure, you know, the length of my arm, the circumference of where the shoulder sits, and I just mark that onto the leather. And I always do it bigger than it needs to be so I can just trim it down. I can keep trying it on and sewing it down. That's just how I work. I know it's not the most efficient way, but it works for me. Once the sleeve was cut out and I'd measured it exactly to fit my arm, I then attached it to the main tunic. You can see here I added a strip of fur, again just referencing back to the cosplay references, because he has like a line of fur going around there. Again, pretty self-explanatory. There's not a lot of technical stuff behind that, it's just adding it in as I go. And this is where the dreaded sleeve starts, and this was one of the scariest bits of the costume, because obviously I'd worked really hard on this tunic piece and now I had to go in and basically cut apart that sleeve, and it was scary. Here I'm marking out where I want to cut the sleeve off to add the red detailing, and then going in with my scissors and just praying to the cosplay gods that nothing goes wrong. But it didn't. So I cut that sleeve off and then cut a segment out where this weird little... It's really hard to phrase this because it's such a bizarre design. I love it, but it's just so bizarre. Where this like segment sits. Using some like cheap red cotton, I cut out a segment. However, this has been stored in my cosplay craft drawer for a while, so it's pretty creased. So let's just rectify that with a quick little transition. Now it's nice and ironed out, we can start actually adding it to the sleeve. Here you can see me cutting out that middle little portion I mentioned. Once I'd taken that off, I then trimmed it to size a little bit and slapped it down onto the red material. And once it was pinned and trimmed a little bit more to shape, I then went in and sewed it together. I used a really heavy stitch for this, but even then I wasn't quite happy with how it looked. It looked too machine done. So even though you barely see this, I then decided afterwards to go in with some red embroidery thread and go over all of that stitching I'd just done, which took way too much time and I didn't need to do, but I did it anyway. And then we're moving on to those little strap bits. Again, self-explanatory, I cut out some strips, I sewed them into the right shape. I measured out 6 of them and then I pinned them to that piece you can see below. I pinned them a little bit curved upwards so it has that nice little curvy shape that this sleeve detail has, before going in with my sewing machine and just sewing them into place. And then it was a case of sewing it all back together. Once again, I hand stitched all of this, because I just felt it was more true to, you know, how Atreus would have done it, and I just liked the effect better. You can see here there's bits of the hand stitching peeking out, which I really like. I'm then going in and doing the scary thing again of just cutting chunks of the leather out to add fur. You can see in these shots as well just how much of this I've done by hand, and It's painful, there was so much. So Atreus has some red stitching details that resembles Kratos' tattoos. And the way that these are shown in the reference are they're a separate layer under the tunic, but then they're also like stitched, so I decided to do a nice mix of that. I went in with my red embroidery thread and just marked out the shape of where I wanted this stitching to be. I technically could have painted this, but I really liked the texture and wanted to add that 3D element to it. He's got a red panel that sits here again with that red material that you see throughout the costume to resemble Kratos' tattoo, so I just cut out a slit and then underneath just layered some of that cheap red cotton, pinned that into place, and then hand stitched it once again. I used a normal cotton for this because I wanted to keep this quite flat because I knew later on I'd be painting some blue on top of it. For the rest of the red stitching details, I did decide to go in with paint. I did this mostly because, like I said, this tunic is very thin leather. If I went in and used lots and lots of stitching, making lots of little holes, I was really worried about it actually ripping. So I knew I didn't need to stitch it and I could get the same effect with acrylic paint, so I did that. Work smarter, not harder. Using a fine brush, I went in with some red acrylic paint. I used acrylic because I knew it would stay pretty flexible once dry, and followed the lines that I'd marked out using my chalk. This bit was very satisfying. I love hand painting details, and that red was so vibrant and pretty. Once I'd finished working with the red, I then went in with a mix of dark brown and black, just to add some shadows where I could see them in the reference to look like a layer beneath the leather, and this just adds a bit more depth to the design as well. Man, watching this back, you just see how much time I put into these bits. There's lots of stitching details on the actual top of the tunic as well, so I went in with my embroidery thread. The leather, even though it's thin, it wasn't thin enough for me to sort of like hand get my needle through it easily, so I decided to go in, use my leather awl and mark out where the holes would be for me to get the stitching through. You're going to see me using this leather awl a lot in the next few videos where I do use leather pieces. Using a nice cream embroidery thread, I go in and just add all the hand stitching details. I used a mixture of like white and cream threads as well as some leather threads on like other parts of the costume. And then we went in to do the blue design he's got on his shoulder. There isn't a good reference of this. Like, there are decent enough references to like get an idea of what it is, but there isn't an exact design. So this was basically entirely winged. I got a bunch of different references up on one screen just to sort of like try and map out the exact shape of it. And then using a pencil, I went in and marked out roughly where I wanted the shapes to be before going in with the blue acrylic. I used this really nice pale blue acrylic that I would then water down to do that nice gradient that you see on this design. I absolutely love this random pop of blue on the costume. It's so pretty and it really sort of ties it in to the tunic underneath, but a really key part of this was using water to fade it out and add the gradient. And then we're on to the final few details. I went in with my airbrush. I went in with some black pigment just to darken where the bigger red sections on the tunic are, and just to add a bit more depth to make it look like, again, like the red part was underneath the leather tunic. I find airbrushing so satisfying. It's one of my favourite parts of the weathering process. I then went in with a very similar colour to the actual tunic itself and went over that blue design I'd done. I did this because I wanted it to look like a worn design and that, you know, it had been painted on but it was slowly rubbing off, and I think the effect's really great. And I love how it sort of like blended it into the rest of the costume as well. There are lots of other little hand stitching details you didn't see in this video just because there was so much that if I documented all of it, it would all get very samey. But if you keep a close eye out for photos, you'll see more details of just how much went into this tunic piece. This was definitely the part of the costume that took the longest. I was on this for like about 5 days, I think. I thought it'd be helpful for you guys to see exactly how I put this on, because whilst I explained it, I think it's always helpful to see, and I'm really proud of how it sits. I think it's a really effective look. It's rare that I'm like openly proud of a costume piece like this, but I'm gonna do a humble brag for a minute and say I love this. Overall, I am really happy with this. I absolutely love how the airbrushing sort of added so much depth to it. I love the textures of all the different stitching and the colours. It's a really effective piece of costume and world building, and I love how complex it is compared to Atreus' first outfit, because I think it really shows just how much of a complex character Atreus is now. Our little wolf cub is all grown up. Thank you so much for watching. Join us next week where I'm going to go a bit more in depth about the leatherwork on this costume. I will see you guys then. Take care.